Welcome back to Grade 8 History, Unit Number 1, Creating Canada, 1850 to 1890. This is Lesson Number 3, What Changed in the Northwest and Pacific Coast. Before we begin today's lesson, let's consider the following. When I'm done talking, I'm going to switch back to the first slide so that you can take a closer look at the painting. And I want you to put the video on pause after I switch back to the first slide so that you can jot down what changes you see taking place in the Northwest based on the painting. All right, so I'm flipping back to the title slide, so please put the video on pause and write down your responses now. All right, let's proceed. In the mid-1800s, Britain faced an important challenge, claiming the land in the Northwest and on the Pacific coast before the United States laid a claim. And this map, which was drawn in 1850, shows that much of what is today Canada and the US was still unclaimed. During the first half of the 19th century, First Nations peoples in the Northwest and on the Pacific coast outnumbered European settlers by more than 100 to 1. The Métis, the descendants of French and English fur traders and their native wives, were also present in these regions. By 1857, the HBC estimated that there were 140,000 First Nations people and 10,000 Métis living in the West. By the mid-1800s, the Red River settlement in Rupert's Land was made up of several cultures: Scottish, Métis, retired French and English HBC employees and their native wives. Many Métis families sent their children to European settler schools to receive an education, while making sure that their children still learned the Métis way of life. In the summer, Métis children worked on the farm. In the autumn, they hunted and trapped, and in winter, they worked as merchants. And you're about to put the video on pause so that you can take a closer look at this photograph. And I want you to write down your response to this question. What does this photograph tell you about the influence of European culture on the Métis way of life? Please put the video on pause now. And let's continue. As good farmland became more and more scarce in the province of Canada, more settlers started moving into Rupert's Land. Primarily of English and Scottish background, the settlers from Canada West dreamed of Rupert's Land becoming an English and Protestant society. This would, in time, threaten both the Métis and the First Nations. And once again, you will be putting the video on pause to take a closer look at this picture and to write down your response to this question. What changes do you see the settlers bringing to Rupert's Land? Please put the video on pause now. And let's continue. Vancouver Island, which is today part of British Columbia, became a colony in 1849. Its first governor, James Douglas, tried to keep peace between the settlers and the First Nations by offering Aboriginal title to a small part of the island. This meant that some land would be legally recognized as First Nations territory. Before 1858, the Pacific Coast region was made up of Vancouver Island and New Caledonia. In 1858, gold was discovered, and the gold rush attracted many from eastern British North America, Europe, and the US. Governor Douglas quickly declared New Caledonia to be a British colony in order to keep the Americans from claiming the region. New Caledonia was renamed British Columbia, and the non-native population grew to over 30,000 in a short period of time. I'll just draw your attention to this image on the left. These were the first miners to arrive in Victoria, BC. Now, when I'm done talking, I want you to put the video on pause so that you can answer this question. What does the mood or the tone appear to be in this picture? Please put the video on pause now. All right, let's move on. The thousands of miners coming in search of gold greatly disrupted the First Nations people's way of life and polluted First Nations fishing waters. In order to bring an end to violent conflicts between the First Nations and the miners, Douglas planned to create native reserves and make deals with the First Nations to settle territorial disputes. However, after Douglas's term as governor ended, the next governor ended the treaty process and refused to offer the First Nations any compensation for the takeover of their lands. And here you see a picture of I.W. Powell, who was the superintendent of Indian Affairs in 1875. He was very critical of Governor Douglas's policy of creating native reserves. Powell felt that Douglas simply left it up to the First Nations peoples to choose the location and amount of reserve land they received, which did not help the government since the goal was to give as much land as possible to European settlers. The Vancouver Island colony soon developed a diverse population. There were thousands of new immigrants, primarily of American origin. There were British and French immigrants, and significant numbers of people of different ethnicities and faiths, including black people and Jewish settlers. A number of Jewish merchants became successful in business and in local politics. Douglas used governments to bring black Americans fleeing slavery to the colony. Some black merchants established businesses that rivaled the HBC, while other black people became volunteer soldiers. And you're going to put the video on pause momentarily to get a closer look at this picture and write down your response to this question. What does the willingness of black American soldiers to volunteer to defend Vancouver Island tell you about their feelings for their new home? Please put the video on pause now. And let's continue. By contrast, Chinese people were not welcomed into the community. By the 1860s, the gold rush was over and coal mining and lumber became the leading industries. Even these industries struggled when the U.S. ended the Reciprocity Treaty and started heavily taxing goods from British Columbia. To create cheaper products, business owners recruited Chinese people as a source of cheap labor. Many Caucasian people felt that Chinese people were taking jobs away from them and treated Chinese laborers very poorly. Very unfortunate when you look at the early history of Chinese immigrant laborers in Canada. We'll be talking about this issue in much greater detail in future lessons. But for now, let's finish today's lesson by considering the following. You will write down your responses to these two questions, and then, of course, we will take them up in our next class. The first question is, what impact did the gold rush have on First Nations who lived in the Pacific Coast region? And two, why do you think some people in British Columbia were more accepting of some cultural groups than others? So what you're going to do is you're going to put the video on pause so that you can read over these questions again and write down your responses. If you don't feel ready to answer one or both of these questions, it means you need to go back and watch this video at least another time. When you're ready, put the video on pause. And I look forward to hearing everybody's responses to these questions as well as the other questions that were included throughout this video. But until we meet again, this concludes today's video.